Subscribe to my YouTube channel. He was called Raza Khan in the newspapers of Adit State, a name everyone learned to hiss quietly, like a curse that lived in the corners of rooms. In the market, mothers pulled children close when his story came up. In the tea houses, men lowered their voices and told the tale as if speaking it aloud might call him back. He had been something else before the headlines: a son, a brother, a boy who laughed. How he became what he became was never a tidy line on any page. Raza's early life was a ledger of losses: a factory closure, a younger sister taken sick because there was no money for a doctor, a father who drank to silence his shame. Those were the small, ordinary violences that stacked until they broke him. People said it was rage, others muttered that it was inevitability, fate bending a person until they snapped. But snap or no, when Raza first stepped into the shadow world of Adit State's underground, something in him hardened into purpose. His crimes were precise at first: robberies that left no bodies, threats that were promises and thus effective. But with each successful escape, the law pressed harder. Then came the night the warehouse burned, and 3 policemen who rushed the flames did not leave. Witnesses later called it a chaos of anger and smoke. Investigators called it arson and murder. Raza was the common answer to both. Whether it was 1 shot or 3, whether the first officer fell before the second, whether it was fear or fury or a miscalculated plan, those details became notes on a file that no longer had a heartbeat. When the trial came, it was a spectacle. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered in place of sympathy and executioners both. Inside, Raza sat with an expression like winter, cold, not in feeling, only distant. The judge read sentences in a voice that tried to sound even. Raza was sentenced to life. The papers printed photographs of him in handcuffs. Some called him monster, others a symptom. Prison softened nothing inside Raza. If anything, it polished the edges. The walls learned his footsteps. The guards learned his silence. Inside those concrete blocks, he took up a reputation wider than his cell. New inmates were warned, stay out of his way. Old hands watched him and moved like he might be a storm that decided to change direction at any moment. Prison became, in its own perverse way, a theater in which small tyrannies were staged day after day. Raza played a principal role. He ruled not with paperwork or official privilege but with an economy built on fear. A look, and a man would stop laughing. A rumor seated by him in its roots would strangle someone else's breath. People paid respects in the form of distance. Guards learned to give him extra space on rounds. Counselors made notes in soft-toned language and then crossed them out. The warden, fond of keeping trouble at arm's length, called him volatile in private memos and a management priority in public. But fear was not enough. Raza fed it, sometimes gently, sometimes with cruelty. He engineered small uprisings with nothing more than a whispered plan and a promise that someone's grudges would be remembered. He used jail-yard grudges like currency, trading protection for favors and protection for silence. If a man fell behind in payments or if a quarrel went the wrong way, he would find his life made harder in ways that did not show up on any official report. Sleep would become a thin thing. Meals would be stolen. Fresh wounds would be explained away as accidents. Outside, the families of those affected by his actions lived with a slow, grinding consequence. Some relatives of the officers who died folded into muted funerals where their grief became a cautionary tale for others. For the families of inmates threatened by Raza, there were nights spent awake with the radiator whispering and the television murmuring police dramas they could no longer sit through. Adit State itself, which had once believed itself safe, adjusted. Policemen walked in pairs. Vendors barred shop doors earlier. The city learned to calculate risk differently. Raza's power inside prison was not absolute. There were rival gangs, ambitious guards, and younger prisoners who sought to carve their own name into the walls. Once, he was cornered. A protest of his methods resulted in a beating that broke a silence people had agreed to keep. But even when bruised, he survived. Survival in that place required instincts sharpened on danger and a willingness, when necessary, to become the monster everyone feared. Survivors often learned that monsters made better company than cowardice. Raza taught that lesson ruthlessly. Still, there were moments when the hardness around him cracked. In the library, between yellowed pages, a photograph of a riverbank slipped from a book. He held it and traced a small child's face with a thumb that had once been soft. The guards saw it from a distance once and told themselves it was nothing. Those small human moments did not erase the ledger of his crimes nor the terror he inspired, but they complicated the portrait. They suggested that inside him, where violence had grown a second skin, a worn humanity lingered like the last embers of a fire. Years passed in prison grew into the main geography of his life. He aged in a way only prison can age a man. The hair went thin, the laugh grew rare, and the stories of his youth became either proof or alibi depending on who told them. He watched through the bars as the city outside kept its light changing. New faces walked its streets, oblivious to the old names. Sometimes he wondered, in a way he could have asked a priest or a counselor if there had been any faith left in either of them, whether his reputation outlived him, whether his legend was already a different thing than the man who once stood in a father's kitchen and promised to make things right. When an earthquake shook Adit State years later, displacing thousands, the newspapers ran pieces about the fragile infrastructures of cities and the hidden worlds of men who live behind walls. In a sidebar, a reporter asked an old guard about Raza. "Still the same?" she asked. The guard shrugged. "People like him never change," he said, but he added something softer, that sometimes fear is ignorance wearing the wrong clothes. In the end, Raza remained a study in contradiction. To some he was a villain who had murdered policemen and traded human knights for his own safety. To others he was a man shaped by a series of cruelties, lashing back at a world that offered him no tenderness. The truth, in the narrow light the prison permitted, was both a man who had done terrible things and a man who had once been allowed to slide into those things without anyone stopping him sooner. Adit State taught itself to forget him and to remember him. In the same breath, the people moved on because they had to, and yet, when a new rumor began to make the rounds, when a fresh-faced inmate learned too quickly the price of standing out, someone would still lower their voice and say the name, Raza Khan. The sound of it was a warning and a question, quilled together, a reminder of how easily ordinary lives can become stories that haunt the rest of a city.